Well, hello everyone. I want to thank the RCMI for inviting me today to give this talk. Most of it's going to be focused on our RCAF exhibition that opened earlier this year at the start of the year at the Juno Beach Center. But I also want to talk a little bit more broadly about what the museum has been doing to mark the 100th anniversary of our Air Force. So before I get into the exhibition, I wanted to share what happened at the Juno Beach Center on April 1st of this year. So we were asked by the RCAF to participate in their RCAF 100 initiative to set a Guinness World Record for the number of landmarks illuminated in 24 hours. So over 500 locations worldwide were involved, but just 56 met the criteria as landmarks set by Guinness. And the JBC was the only location in France to qualify. So we joined the likes of the Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, the Rogers Centre, the CN Tower, and Pearson Airports for some local flavor. So spanning 26 countries and 5 continents, this global effort broke the previous Guinness World Record set in 2010. And at the JBC at the Juno Beach Center, this was done between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. local time on April 1st to celebrate the anniversary. We also at the time granted free entry to our RCAF exhibition that evening with guided tours of the displays. So most of my presentation focuses on the exhibition itself. The exhibition was broken down into 5 zones. They're listed up there on the left. Origins and Training, Captains of the Clouds. It's about the airmen and women of the RCAF during the Second World War. Fighting alongside the RAF, a global air war, and then Zone 5, Charting New Paths, just a very brief section about the Air Force since 1945. The exhibition primarily focuses on the RCAF during the Second World War. I'd also like to acknowledge various individuals, some of whom are in this room, who helped support the exhibition. Mike Bechtold helped us out with some image files, and the exhibition was actually a recycling of a previous exhibition that he had done for the center, and so it was his original skeleton and research that formed the basis of it. I was a co-curator with Louisa Simmons, who since moved on to other employment, but it was a pleasure working with her. At the museum itself, Natalie Worthington, our director, and Hélène Cavillon coordinated on their side. We had a great summer student in 2023, Annika Schreiber, who wrote some of the exhibition. Another intern, Drew Carter, who I think has since, he's at RMC now, he's a civilian, but taking a Master of War Studies. He did our infographic research. And Fred Turgis is our graphic designer over in France. There are also a number of museums and private lenders in Canada who really helped us out. The Juno Beach Center is a visitor center more than kind of a traditional museum. We do have artifacts, but we do have a limited collection, so we really rely on specialized exhibitions like this, on other Canadian, especially institutions, to help us out. So the Royal Canadian Military Institute, and I'll get into some of the stuff that they provided, and Ryan Goldsworthy's role in helping us there. The Billy Bishop Museum up in Owen Sound, Dave Alexander was our liaison there. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, Aaron Napier, their curator helped us with some items. And then we had a model maker. We don't have enough room in the exhibition space for more than maybe one full, size Spitfire. So we had to go with the model route. And there were certain models, and I'll get into that in a little bit, that were provided by Fly Past Rush, David Milkey. He does some amazing, if you look up him on social media, Fly Past Rush, he does amazing 1/48 scale models, all types of Air Force aircraft. So the big idea. Our exhibition was created primarily for audiences that know little about Canada or about the role of the RCAF in the Second World War. But there are plenty of deep dive stories that I'll go into today for anyone who can potentially learn something new. You have to keep in mind our primary audience is European. We're in Europe. The big idea. So the war in the sky lasted from the first day of the conflict to the very last and cost the lives of nearly 18,000 RCAF personnel. This represents an outstanding and essential part of Canada's total war effort. Over nearly 6 years, the RCAF rose to the greatest challenge it has ever faced. It evolved, became more advanced, adept, and inclusive, and emerged from the war as an integral part of Canada's military strategy and identity. And so how did we express our ideas in the exhibition? very different elements, typical of most exhibitions that you've probably seen at museums. So we have biographies, some personal stories. Obviously, photographs play a big role. Text panels to go into some details on certain subjects. The infographics I mentioned earlier. Artifacts. And as a subset of that, and I talked about the models a little bit, those were important pieces, as I'll make clear going forward. And so this presentation is actually going to make ample use of the photographs, quotes, infographics, and the research behind the exhibition's texts. So we had to start with the origins of the RCAF in Zone 1, and here we introduced the visitor to the Canadian military aviation in the First World War and the origins of the RCAF. We finished the section with the interwar period and the state of the RCAF when war is declared. I don't know, maybe this is a similar situation to what we're experiencing now. At the time, there were only 4,000 RCAF personnel. This is before war is declared in 1939, with just 29 frontline fighter and bomber aircraft on the roster. Very small Air Force before the war. We then move into the training section of Zone 1. Here we cover the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in detail. We position it as one of Canada's greatest contributions to victory in the Second World War. And here you can actually see some of our first infographics. So we try to outline the scale of the training, both in terms of the RCAF and its partners. And we found it important because a lot of our audience, again, is European. We wanted to showcase the number of Europeans who were trained in Canada as well. And so it might be harder to read, maybe a bit smaller on the screen, some of the numbers. RCAF aircrew trained in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, almost 26,000 pilots, almost 13,000 air gunners, almost 13,000 navigators, 12,744 wireless operators, 6,659 air bombers or bombardiers, and just over 1,900 flight engineers. So the total of that is 72,853. And there were 17,000, they selected 90,000 aircrew overall to go through the BCATP process in the RCAF. So about 17,000 or more did not actually complete their aircrew training. Then reviewing it by nation, you have this almost 73,000 RCAF. You have 42,000 Royal Air Force, which includes almost 500 Poles, 677 Norwegians, 800 Belgians and Dutch, 900 Czechs, 2,600 Free French, and then 9,600 Royal Australian Air Force, and just over 7,000 Royal New Zealand Air Force, for a total of 131,553 aircrew trained. Cream of the crop was also mentioned earlier in one of the presentations today, and we delved into that a little bit as well, discussing how the RCAF could afford, to some extent, to be picky in the selection of its trainees, especially for aircrew. I think I have the number correct here, but it kind of blows my mind a little bit. Only 90,000 of 600,000 applicants were selected for RCAF aircrew training during the war. This section also briefly discusses the notion of lack of moral fiber, or LMF, which was also discussed earlier today very briefly, but just how they label people who refuse to fly, essentially, especially in RAF Bomber Command. Of note, maybe a lot is made of LMF, but one of the points we wanted to point out was that relatively small numbers when you think about it. There's a lot of people who kind of sucked it up and went on with it without much fuss. But obviously there was those who didn't. Women in the RCAF, talked a little bit about becoming more inclusive. So the Second World War helped open up the service to women in the Air Force. There were two main branches they could join. There was the RCAF Women's Division, first called the Canadian Women's Auxiliary Air Force, modeled after the British, and the RCAF Medical Branch, which included nursing sisters. And so about 17,000 served in the Women's Division, and there were more who served as nursing sisters in the RCAF Medical Branch. Air Commodore Harold Edwards, Air Member of Personnel, was right when he said, quote, "The women chosen to be the first officers or NCOs of the CWAF at the time, before the Women's Division, will have a great opportunity. On them will depend to a very great extent the future of the Air Force." And I'm sure he was right. I will also briefly explore the service of a nursing sister later in this presentation. And so we chose some infographics in this section to kind of delineate some details about women's service in the RCAF, and we included some of the decorations you can see at the bottom that were earned by women serving in the women's division or in the medical branch of the RCAF. We also have a section on discrimination in the RCAF. We thought it was important to include this because of the resilience really often shown by some RCAF members, both in terms of getting through the recruitment process in some cases, and also sometimes in terms of the treatment they received while they were in service. Many of them, would have gone through and not, had too many bad experiences, but some of them would. Bundy, whose picture isn't on the screen, is one of our famous black aviators from the Second World War. He constantly tried to join the RCAF. He was out in the Halifax area, and the local recruiter at the time just kept turning him away. And then he got called up for the Army, and he refused to go. The RCMP showed up and said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "Well, I've already tried to join the RCAF multiple times. I don't want to join the Army." And so eventually they let him into the RCAF, but he had to go through that before he could get there. Earlier in the war, there were higher barriers to entry for non-white applicants. Interestingly, before the war, the barriers weren't even there. So there were members of the RCAF, black members of the RCAF in particular, who had signed up before the war, and then some of the restrictions came in. And then they were lifted in 1942, and it was a lot easier for people for non-white applicants in particular to join. And here's some examples of some of the aviators who managed to join either before the war, like Gerald Bell, whose story came to us through the museum in Hamilton. We also have Flying Officer Joseph Hong, a Chinese Canadian who lost his life on May 22nd, 1944. He was actually with an operational training unit. Basically, it might have been a heavy bomber conversion unit. No, it would have been operational training because he was still on a Whitley bomber. And one of the last things they did before they were sent on to Bomber Command was they did a test run, basically, over occupied territory. That's the mission that he was on with his crew, and they were on just a leaflet mission before D-Day, and they were shot down in France, and he's buried along with the rest of his crew in Bretteville-sur-Lez Canadian War Cemetery. I won't talk too much about the fighter war, because I think Ted might do a bit of that. But we have a section on kind of the fighter war, covers the Battle of Britain, leaning into France, the Dieppe raid, and gaining experience for the final battles. We did an infographic on the top Canadian fighter aces of the Second World War. Had to keep things simple, so we pulled the data from acesofworldwar2.com. Because if you go to different sources, you're going to get varying standards in terms of how they count victories. We also simplified the claims a little bit, for a typical audience. We didn't want to get into explaining what a probable was or what a partial victory was for our audience. We also have one of the centerpieces of the exhibition is a Rolls-Royce Merlin 25 engine. It's the type affixed to a Mosquito Mark 6 fighter bomber aircraft, like the ones used by 418 and 404 squadrons during the Second World War. And that was a loan from the War Heritage Institute in Belgium, one of our European partners. So Strike Hard, the Bomber War. We use this section to outline the origins, purpose, and wartime evolution of RAF Bomber Command and Canada's role within it, both in terms of number 6 group, 15 squadrons, huge symbolic importance to have an entire RCAF group. No other nation had a group within Bomber Command. Canada did. And then obviously the Canadians who served in Bomber Command in RAF units and really across the RAF in any type of squadron. We do mention the debates surrounding the bomber offensive and the loss of civilian lives, but we indicate, it had broad contemporary support, among the Allied peoples at the time. We do state that bombing alone did not win the war, but it was still a crucial factor because bombing destroyed German infrastructure and forced German industry to disperse, which reduced efficiency. Our infographics show the cost to Bomber Command aircrew and Canadians within that, as well as outlining RCAF casualties by year. So you can see the chart on the right, as the war went on and the RCAF and the RCAF's contribution to Bomber Command expanded, the casualties increased quite a lot. 1943 is it's certainly the worst year on a rate basis, but the loss of life didn't stop there in 1944, even though it was an easier year for Bomber Command and an easier year for the RCAF squadrons, who were not always going deep into Germany. They were sometimes attacking targets closer to home in Normandy and in France. Still a lot of sacrifice in those efforts. Over 55,000 of the 120,000 aircrew in Bomber Command lost their lives. So, closing in on a 50% loss rate in terms of fatalities. And of these 55,000, just under 10,700, 10,659 were Canadian. So a huge contribution and a huge sacrifice among Canadians in Bomber Command. We also have a lovely infographic outlining the typical crew sections aboard a heavy bomber. This is a Halifax as the example. And we have some artifacts from Bob Sheridan, whose Lancaster was actually shot down over France in 1944. And we have kind of his locker box, and we also have a piece of the Lancaster bomber as well on display. We don't have a lot of aircraft on display. We have a lot of parts, a lot of mashed up parts of aircraft on display in this exhibition. The Maritime Air War section, we wanted to talk about the role of the RCAF with Coastal Command, which was generally third in priority during the war. It covers the Battle of the Atlantic and the role of the RCAF aircrews in keeping the U-boats at bay. Our infographic map here depicts all 16 U-boats sunk by RCAF aircraft during the war, plus other attacks which damaged submarines. And the zone also features the maritime strike role, including the exploits of 404 Squadron RCAF. When we think about Coastal Command, we often think about the Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats, but there was also a role in terms of maritime strike and attacking, German convoys along the coast and other German installations, other German littoral coastal installations. Being in Europe again, we felt we needed to talk about the global air war that the RCAF fought. And so we did this through a number of different sections, and one of them was the escape lines, escape and evasion in Europe. So we found it incredibly important to highlight the fact that the RCAF and its aircrew were deployed across the world. But given our European audience, we felt it was important to provide some context related to how as many as 12,000 French civilians risked their lives to conceal Allied aircrew. We discussed the Shelburne line, which is depicted on this map in particular, and how Canadians Lucien Dumais and Raymond Laboisse evacuated 118 aircrew between January and March 1944. More than 5,000 Allied aircrew made it back to England across escape lines in Europe, and those escape lines are depicted on the map. We couldn't leave out in the global air war, we couldn't leave out the RCAF and home defense either. So we felt it was important to highlight the role the RCAF played in defending the west and east coasts of Canada, the role of Eastern Air Command in the Battle of the Atlantic specifically, and the role of Western Air Command in building up against a Japanese threat that ultimately never really materialized. Interestingly, a number of the Canadian squadrons that actually served out in Alaska and on the west coast eventually made their way across to Europe. And so we actually have photos in our collection from, aircrew who served in Normandy, who also served in Alaska. And so you've got some photos there of the RCAF in Alaska with their Curtiss Kitty Hawk fighters. The map here is actually, I have to credit this to the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. It's from their collection. And it was actually created by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, in 1913, but was updated for use during the Second World War to show the presence of Nazi U-boats in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So we also wanted to make sure we covered that aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Battle of the St. Lawrence. Given our location, obviously, it's important to feature the RCAF in the Battle of Normandy in some detail. Some former air bases for RCAF squadrons are only a short trip from our museum. Parts of these airfields can still be found as parts of farmers' fences in Normandy, and we have some airfield surfacing tools on display at the museum. There were 39 RCAF squadrons supporting the D-Day landings in the wider battle. They had individual roles of different types: bombers, fighters, fighter bombers, fighter reconnaissance, maritime strike, anti-submarine units, transport units. Well, there were Canadians in transport units, but the Canadian transport units didn't exist till after D-Day, actually. There were an unknown number of Canadian aircrew killed, and I suspect this is likely in the hundreds, if not the low thousands, in operations related to Normandy. But we do know something about the Canadian air personnel killed in D-Day related operations. So what we did is we wanted to include a map of RCAF losses on D-Day. So all the little numbers in yellow on the map indicate roughly where an aircraft with Canadian air crew in it, not necessarily an RCAF aircraft, went down on D-Day. There were 22 RCAF air personnel killed on D-Day. One Canadian who had actually volunteered to join the RAF, we don't actually have his image, who actually landed at Omaha Beach with one of the RAF beach units that was going to set up some of the radar and other capabilities later on D-Day. And 2 Canadians who were actually listed as killed on future days, but their aircraft actually went down on D-Day and other crew members were killed on D-Day. So I suspect there might be an error in that log. So it might be as many as 25 Canadian, air-related personnel killed on D-Day. And I'd like to point out number 13 on the map. I don't know how well you can see that. It's just below, you can see where the line with the British flag on it comes. That's the 6th Airborne Division. It's in that region. And it'll become fairly clear why that is. So number 13 is Pilot Officer Harvey Edgar Jones. I'm going to tell a little bit about the story of his aircraft here through his wireless operator and air gunner, Colby Engelberg. So they were part of a C-47 Dakota crew that was delivering British paratroopers to Normandy and supplies on the eve, June 5, 6, 1944. And as they crossed the coast, the aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. They didn't at first realize that it had been damaged, but it was actually burning. And the paratroops managed to jump out, and everybody was going to ditch the aircraft once they realized this was the problem. But Harvey Edgar Jones, who was the pilot of the aircraft, kind of a similar circumstance a little bit to Mynarski, he looked back and saw that his friend, who had served with for quite some time, Colby Engelberg, was unconscious on the floor. So instead of jumping out of the aircraft himself, he went back to the controls and tried to crash land the aircraft in a farmer's field. Unfortunately, when he did that, he did save Colby's life. Colby survived, but the pilot was thrown from the aircraft and killed. There's a long story behind it, but basically Harvey Edgar Jones was recommended for the Victoria Cross, but he did not receive it. It was basically at higher command levels, didn't make it up to a Canadian level. This was a Canadian serving in an RAF unit. They just said if we gave it to him, we'd have to give it to so many others, and especially in Bomber Command, that sort of thing happened all the time. I think what was different between him and Mynarski is Mynarski was the wireless operator. He was not the pilot. He was not in command of the aircraft, whereas Harvey Edgar Jones was. He maybe had a duty to stay at the controls to help his friend. So we actually have pieces of the Dakota, as you can see on the left there, on display. That came out of the farmer's field a few years ago. It's not really recognizable, but there are pieces of a C-47. And again, the modeling was really important for us because we wanted people to see, like, here's what the actual aircraft looked like. I actually have some pieces, if you'd like to come around and see them, of the C-47 in a little case over by the book stand there. I told you I was going to tell you about a nursing sister. Molly Mulholland was an RCAF nursing sister in Normandy, and she helped with the essential job of keeping casualties alive and evacuating them eventually to specialized hospitals in the UK. A little known fact about the Battle of Normandy is the Allies did a really great job of casualty evacuation and using aircraft on improvised runways. Some of the C-47s that survived the airborne landings were used to ferry these casualties out. So, quick facts on Molly. She was actually one of the first Canadian women to land in Normandy. and she actually postponed her marriage to go overseas as an RCAF nursing sister. And her fiance was in the RCAF. And sadly, in 1942, he was killed when his fighter aircraft was shot down over the Mediterranean, just around the same time she was about to cross the Atlantic to England. Her job primarily was supervising operating rooms. And as I said, she was one of the first 3 Canadian nurses to arrive in Normandy, and she was with the number 52 RCAF Mobile Field Hospital. She spent 8 months as a nurse in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and was awarded the Royal Red Cross Class 1 by King George. And we have some of her artifacts, personal artifacts, on display in that section as well. And if I'm looking at the photograph, I believe the photograph on the right, she is sitting on the right-hand side looking at the male medical officer. This is one of my favorite artifacts and displays in the exhibit. And once again, we made use of our modeler to recreate the Mustang in this case. We actually have the pieces of the Mustang Mark I that was once flown by Flying Officer Francis Goring. He has kind of an unfortunate last name, I suppose, given Hermann Goring's status in the Luftwaffe. But anyway, sadly, we also have his parachute, which seems to have never been used. It's in fairly good shape. I mean, a little bit damaged, a little bit ratty, but it's in fairly good shape. And that was found at the site of his aircraft crash, and he was found in the aircraft itself. He never had a chance to use the parachute. He was shot down late in the Battle of Normandy near Falaise on a reconnaissance sortie, and he was killed in the crash. We have the parachute, a piece of one of the blades of the propeller, the aircraft's tail wheel, and actually a piece of the Allison engine from the Mustang that were, again, dug up from a French farmer's field some years ago. Finishing off the global air war, couldn't forget the RCAF and its role in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. 413 Squadron in Ceylon, 417 Squadron and 331 Wing RCAF, the 3 bomber squadrons in North Africa, and they didn't actually serve in Italy, they bombed Italy a lot. They were always based in North Africa. And 435 and 436 squadrons, those were transport squadrons based in India, actually modern day parts of Pakistan, I believe, at times. And there were Canadians, of course, scattered across the world in RCAF units. And so some of the summer dress jacket belonging to D.L. Nash is from the Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton. The Kukri knife and compass belonged to Delbert Budd, who was stationed in Burma, and that's from the Billy Bishop Home and Museum. The pith helmet used by Alex J. Rees while he was stationed in Burma is also from the Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton. And then one of the big contributions of the RCMI itself is, again, we wanted to tell the story of the post-war RCAF and the legacy that they left. And part of their legacy is, of course, in Europe. Number 1 Canadian Air Division, which was stationed in France as part of its commitment to NATO during the Cold War. And we wanted to let our French audience in particular know about that. So thank you to the RCMI for providing us with the story of Air Vice Marshal Lawrence Ray, who went on from his service in the Second World War. I think he was a prisoner of war as a group captain in Germany, and he went on to be Air Officer Commanding of Number 1 Air Division. Just to conclude, we conclude the exhibition again with a reflection on the legacy of the RCAF in the past 100 years and the place of the Second World War within this legacy. The price of the war in the air was high. About 45,000 Canadians died during the Second World War. About 18,000 of them were RCAF. It's about over one-third of Canada's losses in the war. The RCAF in 1944, January was its peak. It was bigger than it has ever been, and hopefully, I hope, such mobilization won't be necessary again. And the modern-day RCAF owes much of its legacy to those who served in the Second World War. Very, very briefly, Legacy of Honor, Spotlight, we now have 5. I know it was mentioned before, we now have 5 RCAF veterans featured in our Legacy of Honor veteran interview series, and you can check those out on our website, junobeach.org. And I think that's all I have. So thank you very much for your attention during this overview of how the Juno Beach Centre has marked the centenary of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I hope some of you will visit our museum soon.
Thank you, Alex. And does anyone here have any questions? If you do, please step to the microphone.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for that talk and for bringing the exhibition to us, those who maybe didn't have a chance to go to France to see it. It looks great. My question for you, Alex, given that the Juno Beach Center is situated on Juno Beach, could you speak to how the importance of having a museum on a battlefield and how that affects the interpretation at the museum, speaking to that advantage? Thanks.
Really great question. I think the Juno Beach Center certainly wouldn't be what it is without being located where it is. That's such a huge part of what we do. It's a very emotive experience for a lot of our visitors. And in part, some of the displays are kind of meant to bring up those emotions, I think, in some ways as well. Part of the best thing that we do, I think, at the Juno Beach Center is our student guide program. We have young, usually 18 to kind of 25-year-old, they can be a little bit older than that, guides, usually 7 to 9 every year, who approximate the ages of those, men who landed on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, to tell that story. And, we're very privileged that we have a couple of the original bunkers that the Germans used to defend Mike Red sector of Juno Beach. Mike Red sector was one of the deadliest sectors of Juno for the Canadian Army on June 6th. The company that landed in front of our museum suffered some 80% casualties, and the engineers with them as well. And being able to take, the guides do an amazing job taking people through some of those defensive positions to examine the observation post and the company command post, essentially, and the defenses that the Germans had, which while they complained about them, they thought they could be better, they were still pretty imposing. And so, yeah, it's a special thing to have a place like we do, on a battlefield like that. We're so very grateful for the Canadian support in the last few years. We fought off a condo development that was going to go right next to us. And, well, thanks to Canadians. And one of the great things we're going to be doing is putting in, expanding essentially what's called Juno Park, which is where those guides operate outside the museum, turning it into a nice, quiet, reflective space, but also adding a memorial. We do not have we don't have a Second World War official national memorial in this country, technically, but we don't also on Juno Beach have a memorial that lists the names of all, I would say, 381 Canadians who lost their lives on D-Day. That includes the Air Force. And we're going to be putting a memorial in the next couple of years that has those names on it. And so we're very excited about that, and it'll bring a new element. There's already the commemorative bricks, and those are very special at the museum as well. The commemorative bricks that people who have supported the museum have sponsored to have the name of a relative or something. And so it'll just be another added element to that. So thanks for the question.
Any other questions for Alex? Alex, welcome as always. Thank you for everything.
Appreciate it.
You bet. Let me give you a presentation here. Alex already has a collection of these from the RCMI, but always willing to accept another.
Absolutely,
Right?
sure thing. Thank you very much.
And thank you again.